August 1942, a railhead somewhere south of Alexandria, Egypt. Dust hangs in the air like a curtain. Men from the Royal Army Service Corps are bolting ramps to a flatbed trailer the length of a cricket pitch, and behind them, idling in the heat, sits something that does not belong on a battlefield. It is a truck, an American commercial truck built in Chicago, painted desert sand, and it is enormous. The cab alone weighs more than a fully loaded Bedford 3-tonner. Behind the cab sits a steel box filled with 5 one-ton concrete blocks, pressing the rear axles into the ground like ballast on a cargo ship. The trailer it is coupled to rides on 24 tyres across 12 wheels, and the whole rig, tractor and trailer combined, stretches nearly 60 feet from bumper to ramp. It carried no gun. It wore no armour. It could barely manage 23 miles per hour on a good road, and in soft sand it sank like a stone. It looked absurd. A civilian haulage truck dressed in khaki, dragging the biggest trailer most soldiers had ever seen, crawling along behind an army that was fighting for its survival. And yet this vehicle would recover more destroyed British tanks than any other machine in the war. It would haul shattered Shermans out of the Egyptian desert, drag burning Churchills off the beaches of Normandy, and carry crippled Grants down the mountain passes of Italy. It would serve on 3 continents, remain in British military service for nearly 30 years after the war ended, and quietly transform the way Britain fought with armour forever. Its designation was the Diamond T Model 980, and it was the truck that let Britain put its broken tanks back into the fight. To understand why this vehicle existed, you need to understand the problem Britain faced in the Western Desert in 1941. Tanks were dying faster than Britain could build them. Total British domestic tank production across the entire war would reach only 27,528 vehicles. The United States, by comparison, built over 49,000 Shermans alone. Britain's entire wartime tank output was barely more than half of a single American type. Every tank knocked out in the desert that could have been repaired but was abandoned represented a hole that British factories simply could not fill. The economics were brutal. A Sherman tank cost between $33,000 and $67,000 in 1942, roughly $500,000 to over $1 million today. A field repair, replacing blown tracks, patching armour, swapping a damaged engine, cost a fraction of that and could be completed in days. But to repair a tank, you first had to get it off the battlefield. And in 1941, Britain had almost nothing capable of doing that. The existing option was the Scammell Pioneer, a 6-wheel drive artillery tractor pressed into recovery service. It produced only 102 horsepower and was rated to tow perhaps 20 to 30 tons. The tanks Britain was now fielding, the M3 Grant at 30 tons, the Sherman at 33, the Churchill at nearly 40, were simply too heavy. The Scammell could not carry them. It could barely drag them. Meanwhile, the Germans were methodically recovering every knocked-out panzer from the battlefield, repairing them and sending them back into action. Britain was hemorrhaging armour it could not replace, and the enemy was recycling theirs. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington approached several American truck manufacturers with a precise specification. The vehicle had to carry tanks weighing up to 40 tons. Its height could not exceed 150 inches. To pass under low British bridges, it needed between 175 and 200 brake horsepower, and it had to use proven, commercially available components for engine, transmission and axles, because the last thing the British Army needed in the middle of a war was a bespoke machine that could not be maintained in the field. The Diamond T Motor Car Company of Chicago answered the call. Founded in 1905 by Charles Arthur Tilt, the company had been building trucks for 3 decades. The name came from Tilt's father, a shoe manufacturer whose logo featured a T framed by a diamond, symbolizing quality. By the 1930s, Diamond T trucks had earned the reputation of the Cadillac of trucks. Now they would build something rather different. The vehicle itself was a masterpiece of practical engineering. The heart of the Diamond T was the Hercules DFXE, a naturally aspirated inline 6-cylinder diesel displacing 855 cubic inches, just over 14 litres. It produced 201 brake horsepower at 1600 revolutions per minute, with 685 pound-feet of torque at 1150 revolutions per minute. That torque figure was the key. Raw pulling power at low speed, exactly what was needed to haul a 40-ton load up a desert road. The British had specifically demanded a diesel engine for fuel economy and commonality with other British military vehicles, and this was one of the very few diesels fitted to any American tactical truck during the entire war. The transmission was a fuller 4-speed main gearbox mated to a fuller 3-speed auxiliary, producing 12 forward and 3 reverse gear ratios. This gave the driver extraordinarily precise speed control under maximum load. The drive configuration was 6x4, meaning the front axle steered only while the 2 rear axles were driven with dual wheels. Behind the cab sat the ballast body, a steel box that crews filled with concrete blocks or sandbags to press weight onto the driven rear axles and improve traction. The winch was a Gar Wood unit mounted behind the cab, capable of pulling 40,000 pounds. On the original Model 980, 300 feet of cable ran rearward only. The improved Model 981, introduced in 1942, carried 500 feet of cable that could be deployed from both front and rear, allowing the vehicle to winch itself out of trouble or pull a disabled tank toward it from any direction. Coupled to the tractor was the M9 trailer, a massive low-loading platform manufactured by the Rogers Brothers Corporation of Albion, Pennsylvania. It rode on 12 wheels fitted with 24 tyres and was rated to carry 45 short tons. Hinged ramps dropped down at the rear. The winch cable ran through rollers along the trailer deck to pull immobilized tanks up the ramps. Operational tanks could drive aboard under their own power. Chains and chocks secured the load. The full rig, tractor and loaded trailer weighed over 50 tons and consumed fuel at roughly 2 miles per gallon. Approximately 5,871 Diamond T tractors were built between 1941 and 1945. Around 1,000 went directly to Britain under Lend-Lease, shipped in partially knocked-down condition and reassembled by Pearsons of Liverpool before deployment. Over 6,700 M9 trailers were manufactured to go with them. Now, before we get into where this truck actually fought, if you are enjoying this deep dive into British wartime logistics and military engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. The Diamond T first reached the British 8th Army in North Africa in 1942, entering service with Royal Army Service Corps tank transporter companies. The 372nd Tank Transporter Company RASC is confirmed transporting Valentine 4 tanks in the Western Desert, while the 373rd moved Grants and Crusaders, but the vehicle proved its true worth at the Second Battle of El Alamein, which began on October 23, 1942. Over 1,100 Allied tanks were engaged against more than 540 Axis machines. The fighting was savage. The Allies lost approximately 150 tanks knocked out. The Axis lost roughly 500 of their 527. Critically, Britain held the battlefield afterward, and that single fact changed everything. British tanks could be recovered, Axis tanks could not. Diamond T's hauled damaged Shermans and Grants back to field workshops, where craftsmen worked around the clock to return them to fighting condition. This was the first major operation after the formation of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, known as REME, established on October 1, 1942, just weeks before El Alamein began. REME absorbed approximately 5,000 officers and 80,000 men from scattered maintenance units across multiple corps, creating for the first time a single dedicated organisation responsible for recovering and repairing every piece of military equipment in the British Army. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery later described REME's role in 5 words: keeping the punch in the Army's fist. The Diamond T was the vehicle that made that punch possible. REME organised recovery in echelons. Light aid detachments of 12 to 25 craftsmen, the Corps used the term craftsman rather than private, were attached permanently to fighting units for first-line repair. Brigade workshops handled heavier work. Heavy recovery sections, equipped with Diamond T transporters, specialised in extracting and moving disabled tanks to divisional and corps workshops further back. The principle was repair as far forward as possible. Statistics from the 53rd Infantry Division in Northwest Europe illustrate the scale. Their light aid detachments alone repaired 555 vehicles damaged by enemy action, plus 6,250 with other faults. In Italy from 1943, the Diamond T faced the opposite challenge to the desert: narrow mountain roads, steep gradients, demolished bridges, and endless mud. The 610th Heavy Recovery Section, REME, is documented in December 1943 carrying a Bishop 25-pounder self-propelled gun on a Diamond T in Italy. The vehicle's low gearing proved an advantage on mountain switchbacks, though the rig's sheer length, nearly 60 feet, made tight turns a serious challenge. Crews sometimes had to reverse, disconnect the trailer, reposition it by hand, and reconnect before continuing. Northwest Europe from June 1944 was the Diamond T's biggest theatre. While not landed on D-Day itself, Diamond T's arrived via landing ships tank in the days following the initial assault. REME played a critical role in beach recovery operations. During Operation Goodwood on July 18, 1944, 314 British tanks were knocked out. Of those, 140 were total write-offs, meaning approximately 55% were recovered and returned to service. Without Diamond T's to haul those wrecked vehicles from the Cairn corridor back to repair workshops, that recovery rate would have been impossible. In preparations for Operation Plunder, the Rhine crossing in March 1945, Diamond T's were photographed transporting Churchill Churchill tanks and Buffalo amphibious vehicles to staging areas. Churchill armoured recovery vehicles working alongside Diamond T's recovered at least 8 Sherman DD amphibious tanks that bogged down emerging from the Rhine. The vehicle even served in Burma, where it carried Grant tanks and Grant armoured recovery vehicles through the Southeast Asian theatre in 1945. British post-war analysis of 3,710 knocked-out tanks across all theatres revealed that 22.3% of losses were caused by mines, damage that typically immobilised vehicles but left hulls and turrets intact, making them ideal recovery candidates. German High Command documents confirm the Allies' success. By mid-1943, Germany was applying a 50% reduction factor to its own troops' tank kill claims, acknowledging that half the tanks they reported destroying were being salvaged and sent back into battle. The contrast between Allied and German tank recovery methods reveals why the Diamond T system was strategically superior. Germany relied primarily on the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 9, known as the FAMO, an 18-ton half-track producing 270 horsepower. It could tow lighter tanks like the Panzer III or IV individually, but for a Panther or Tiger I, 3 or more FAMOs had to be coupled together, an enormous waste of resources requiring multiple crews and vehicles to move a single tank. Approximately 2,500 were built across the entire war. Germany also produced the Bergepanther, a dedicated recovery vehicle on the Panther tank chassis, but only 339 were manufactured, and each consumed the production resources of a medium tank. The Diamond T's advantage was systemic. One tractor could carry any Allied tank on its trailer at road speed, preserving the recovered tank's tracks and running gear. The German towing method wore out both the recovery vehicles and the tanks being towed. The Diamond T cost a fraction of a Bergepanther, consumed far less fuel, and could be manufactured in quantity, 5,871 versus 339. The M25 Dragon Wagon, produced by Pacific Car and Foundry, was the American equivalent that entered service in 1944. It was technically superior, 6-wheel drive instead of 6x4, 240 horsepower, an armoured cab, 60-ton combined winch capacity from twin winches, but only approximately 1,372 were built. The Diamond T remained Britain's primary heavy tank transporter throughout the entire war, and the M25 never replaced it in British service. The Diamond T's military career did not end in 1945. It remained the British Army's primary tank transporter into the early 1950s, when the Thornycroft Antar began replacing it. Remarkably, a few Diamond T's continued serving in British tank transporter units until 1971, 3 decades after first entering production. Some were re-engined in the late 1950s with Cummins diesels to extend their service life. Decommissioned Diamond T's found second careers in civilian heavy haulage across Britain. Winds of Newport, Wales operated 30 of them. Pickfords ran 12. They became a familiar sight on British roads hauling low-loaders and industrial machinery. In Australia, surplus Diamond T's served as outback road train prime movers. Kurt Johansson's legendary Diamond T 980 is preserved at the National Road Transport Hall of Fame in Alice Springs. Today, approximately 70 Diamond T's survive in private ownership in Britain and regularly appear at historic vehicle shows. The Imperial War Museum maintains an extensive photographic and film archive documenting Diamond T operations across every theatre. The National Army Museum holds wartime photographs showing Diamond T's being loaded in 1944. Restored examples have been sold through R.M. Sotheby's. In the Netherlands, Dutch Army Diamond T's appear at historic army days at Oorschot, carrying Sherman tanks for public display. One famous post-war photograph shows 2 Diamond T tractors coupled together to tow the 78-ton experimental Tortoise heavy assault tank in 1948. August 1942, a railhead south of Alexandria. A massive American truck sits idling in the dust, coupled to a trailer on 24 tyres, carrying nothing but concrete blocks and the skepticism of every officer who looks at it. It was slow, 23 miles per hour. It was thirsty, 2 miles per gallon. It had no armour, no weapons of its own, no ability to cross soft ground without sinking, and no protection for the crews who drove it within range of enemy guns. And yet it worked. It worked in the sand dunes west of El Alamein, where it hauled burning Shermans to workshops that returned them to Montgomery's line within days. It worked on the mountain passes of Italy, where crews disconnected trailers and repositioned them by hand around switchbacks that no 60-foot rig should have been able to navigate. It worked on the beaches of Normandy, where it carried the wrecks of Operation Goodwood back to depots that repaired 55% of them. It worked on the approaches to the Rhine, where it moved Churchill tanks to the crossing points that broke the last German defensive line. Britain could not outproduce Germany in tanks. It produced barely half as many tanks in total as America built of a single type. What Britain could do, with 5,871 Diamond T's and 158,000 REME craftsmen, was recover and repair more than half its knocked-out armour and send it back into the fight. Every tank recovered was a tank the factories did not need to replace. Every tank repaired was a tank that hit the enemy twice. The Diamond T 980 was not fast. It was not elegant. It was not even British. But it carried carried the weight of an army's armour on 24 tyres across 3 continents, and it did not stop for 30 years. That is not luck. That is the difference between an army that abandoned